The year is 1210, and the bells of Europe toll across valleys still wrapped in morning mist. Their sound rolls through the air like waves upon a quiet sea, summoning farmers from sleep, monks from prayer, and merchants from dreams of gold. Faith was not a choice in this world. It was the air itself. Every breath, every oath, every birth and burial passed through the shadow of the church. The great cathedrals of the 13th century rose higher than any fortress, their spires clawing into the clouds as if to pierce heaven. The people believed those stones were holy, that light filtered through stained glass carried the warmth of God himself. For a peasant plowing damp soil in Burgundy or a widow lighting a candle in Aragon, the church was both the promise of eternal life and the law that bound their mortal one. Europe at this time seemed at peace, but it was the stillness of a forest before a storm. In the villages, priests preached of divine order, of heaven above and hell below, of a chain of obedience that stretched from the throne of God to the humblest soul. Kings ruled by divine right, lords ruled by the king's favor, and beneath them all, the people knelt. Yet within that hierarchy, there was comfort. The calendar turned with the rhythm of holy days, Lent, Pentecost, Advent, and the feast of every saint whose name adorned the village chapel. Bells marked the hours, prayers marked the day. The church was everywhere, and for most, that presence felt like safety. But the more tightly faith held the world, the more shadows gathered at its edges. In monasteries where candlelight burned long into the night, whispers of uncertainty began to stir. Some questioned why the church's wealth grew while the poor starved. Others wondered why salvation could be purchased, why forgiveness had a price. Still others, in distant corners of Europe, preached a simpler gospel, one that spoke of humility and inner light. At first, these murmurs were faint, scattered, and easily dismissed. But faith, like any flame, draws attention to whatever it cannot illuminate. In the highlands of Languedoc, a region of rolling hills and golden fields, faith took on a different shape. There, people listened to wandering teachers who spoke softly about purity and spirit, about a God untouched by the corruption of the world. They called themselves the good Christians. The church called them heretics. But in this moment, before the fires, before the swords, they were only seekers of truth, living among neighbors who still prayed beside them. The difference was invisible, almost delicate. And yet, that difference would soon divide an entire age. Across Europe, the great cathedrals continued to rise. In Paris, the towers of Notre Dame reached completion, casting long shadows over the Seine. In Chartres, craftsmen shaped stone angels that seemed to breathe beneath the chisel's touch. To the faithful, these were monuments of love. To others, they were reminders of the church's immense power. Each cathedral was a sermon carved in stone, its arches whispering of eternity, its carvings warning of damnation. But beauty and fear lived side by side. Every painting of paradise had its shadow, its demons, its flames, its warning that doubt was death to the soul. For most, such fear was enough to keep belief pure. But in every generation, there are those who listen differently. There were scholars in Bologna and Paris who dared to read forbidden texts, ancient philosophers who spoke of reason, balance, and inquiry. They did not reject God, but they questioned the human hands that claimed to speak for him. And in those questions lay a quiet rebellion, one that would grow from thought to movement, from movement to persecution. Still, in these early years of the century, the church's hold felt unshakable. The Pope ruled not just from Rome but from the very conscience of Christendom. Kings sought his blessing before war, peasants sought his mercy before death. The Holy See was both shepherd and sword, guiding and guarding a flock that dared not stray. To live outside its grace was to risk eternal fire. To challenge it was to challenge the very order of the universe. And yet, somewhere deep within the heart of Europe, something began to stir, a sense that faith, once a refuge, could also become a weapon. That the same love which inspired art and devotion could also ignite fear and bloodshed. No one saw it clearly then, not even those who would soon suffer for it. But history, viewed from the calm distance of centuries, shows the faint outlines of that shift, the way belief hardened into certainty, and certainty into judgment. Imagine walking through a medieval marketplace at dusk. The air smells of smoke and bread, the sound of bells mixing with laughter. A friar preaches beneath a wooden cross, warning of sin, while a group of merchants haggle nearby over bolts of linen. Children chase each other through the crowd, their laughter rising above the murmured prayers. The world feels alive, ordinary, innocent. Yet somewhere, perhaps in that same crowd, stands a man whose thoughts differ from the sermon being preached, a man who believes in God, but in a way his church would not approve. He does not yet know that his belief will soon mark him as dangerous. The 13th century was an age of contrasts, faith and fear, beauty and brutality intertwined. It was a time when men built monuments to the divine while kindling the fires that would destroy those who disagreed. The church stood as both the guardian of civilization and the architect of its darkest trials. Its leaders spoke of mercy while preparing for war. Its followers sought salvation only to find suspicion. For now, though, the world slept under the illusion of peace. The bells still rang, prayers still rose, and no one imagined that faith itself would soon turn upon its believers. The light of devotion still burned brightly, but in that light, the first shadows had already begun to form. Doubt rarely arrives as thunder. It begins as a whisper, a question left unspoken in the silence after prayer, a pause before reciting familiar words. In the early years of the 13th century, these whispers began to drift through monasteries, marketplaces, and universities alike. Europe had been united under a single faith for nearly 1,000 years, its people bound by the certainty that the Church was the keeper of all truth. Yet now, in candlelit rooms where parchment met ink, some minds began to stir. They wondered if the divine could truly be contained within walls of stone or written in Latin alone. The world was changing quietly, and faith, though still mighty, had begun to tremble. The Church had long taught that salvation flowed through its hands alone. Priests stood between man and God, their words transforming bread into the body of Christ, their authority shaping every soul's eternal fate. But as Europe's population grew and trade flourished, new voices emerged, poets, philosophers, and wandering preachers who spoke in the common tongue. They questioned why the path to heaven seemed paved with coin. They asked why a pope could bless kings to wage war while preaching peace from the pulpit. These questions were not rebellion, at least not at first. They were born from devotion, from the ache to understand the divine more deeply. Yet to question was to unsettle power, and power, like stone, cracks slowly before it breaks. In the hills and towns of southern France, the region of Languedoc had become a meeting ground of faiths and philosophies. There, the people were educated, their cities prosperous, their culture unusually tolerant. Troubadours sang of love and virtue, scholars debated Aristotle, and merchants from distant lands shared new ideas. It was a place where the air itself seemed freer. Amid this freedom rose a group who called themselves the Pure Ones, the Cathars. They believed the world was a battlefield between light and darkness, spirit and flesh. To them, the Church had grown too rich, too worldly, too far from the teachings of Christ. They preached that true faith lived in the heart, not in relics or rituals. For the poor, weary of corruption, these words felt like water to a thirsty soul. But to Rome, such ideas were poison. A faith outside the Church was not faith at all. It was heresy, and heresy threatened the order of creation. The Church had faced dissent before, small sects that came and went, burned out or reabsorbed into orthodoxy. Yet the Cathars were different. They were disciplined, charismatic, and above all, peaceful. They lived modestly, rejected violence, and preached equality in the eyes of God, a vision both beautiful and dangerous in an age built upon hierarchy. Even nobles and knights began to protect them, drawn more by their integrity than by doctrine. The Pope's envoys took note, and soon the word heresy began to echo across the land with growing urgency. In distant monasteries, the scholars of the Church fought doubt with ink and scripture. They wrote long treatises defending the purity of the faith, condemning those who questioned its order. They believed themselves guardians of truth, protectors of a flock easily misled. But beneath their certainty lay fear that their authority was not divine but human, that centuries of ritual might crumble if people learned to read the gospel for themselves. Printing had not yet arrived, but whispers travel faster than books. And when those whispers spoke of a God who dwelled not in cathedrals but in conscience, they carried a quiet, contagious power. The papacy, under Innocent III, ruled as both spiritual and temporal empire. He saw himself as the vicar of Christ on earth, responsible for the souls of millions. To him, dissent was not mere disagreement, it was disease. And a disease, if left unchecked, would spread. In letters to kings and bishops, he warned that heresy was a cancer devouring the body of the Church. His words carried the weight of eternity, and the rulers of Europe obeyed. Yet in those very letters lies the paradox of the age, a church that preached love, but prepared for purgation. The road from faith to fear was being paved not by malice, but by conviction. Meanwhile, among the people, uncertainty began to grow. In some villages, families divided over belief. One brother would confess to a priest, another would meet a cathedral preacher in secret. Neighbors who once prayed together now watched one another carefully, uncertain which form of worship might bring salvation or suspicion. Yet the Church's official stance was clear: there could be only one truth, one interpretation, one shepherd. All else was deception. And so, the idea of questioning faith became the greatest sin of all. Still, doubt persisted. It hid in the hearts of monks who copied holy texts but found contradictions within them. It flickered in the eyes of mothers who saw their hungry children while the Church collected tithes in gold. It lingered in the confessions of men who wondered whether the voice of God was louder in the wind than in the sermon. These were small, private heresies, invisible in their time, yet powerful enough to move history. The Church could silence dissenters, but it could not silence thought itself. The tension between faith and fear began to hum like a tightening string. The more the Church condemned doubt, the more doubt spread, not in open rebellion, but in quiet minds that no longer found peace in ritual alone. The Cathars, though few, embodied this transformation. They offered a vision of purity unsullied by corruption, of a God beyond politics and punishment. To the poor and humble, their message was irresistible. To the powerful, it was intolerable. The Pope's patience thinned. Letters turned to decrees, decrees to threats. Papal legates were sent to Languedoc to reason, to warn, to intimidate. But reason met resistance and fear met faith. Local lords hesitated to crush their own people, and some even sheltered the heretics out of loyalty or conscience. In Rome, this defiance was unthinkable. The whispers that had begun in monasteries had now reached the ears of kings. The Church, which once saw itself as healer, began to imagine itself as surgeon, cutting away the disease to save the whole. By the end of the decade, the line between faith and control had blurred completely. The people still prayed, still lit candles, still whispered the same ancient blessings. But the warmth of devotion had cooled into something harder, something watchful. Salvation was no longer simply a promise, it was an obligation. Doubt, once the companion of thought, had become the enemy of order. Europe stood on the edge of transformation, though no one yet knew how deep the darkness would reach. What began as the gentle murmur of conscience would soon become the roar of fire and steel. And when that moment came, faith itself would become both judge and executioner. The seeds of doubt had been sown, and in the soil of devotion, they would grow into tragedy. The hills of Languedoc were bathed in the soft gold of the southern sun, their slopes covered with vineyards, olive groves, and winding paths that seemed to lead both into the earth and toward the heavens. In these valleys, life moved at a slower rhythm. Stone villages clung to cliffsides, their rooftops red with age, their streets so narrow that neighbors could speak across the gap between windows. To travelers from the north, this land seemed touched by grace, rich, beautiful, and strangely free. Here, faith was woven into daily life, but it felt gentler than the rigid order of Rome. People prayed before their meals, but they also debated, questioned, and sought meaning beyond the rituals prescribed by priests. In Languedoc, the soul of Christianity still breathed like an untamed wind. The Cathars had found fertile ground here, not only for their beliefs but for their way of living. They called themselves the good men and good women, and they walked among the people with humility. They dressed plainly, ate little, and refused to swear oaths or shed blood. To the farmers, their lives seemed closer to the spirit of Christ than the bishops who traveled with guards and gold. When they spoke, they did not shout of damnation or demand tithes. Instead, they whispered of purity, of the light that lived within every person, of the hope that souls might one day be freed from the corruption of the flesh. Their teachings were simple but profound, that love, not fear, was the path to salvation. At first, the church's presence in the region was minimal. The local clergy were few, often indifferent, and far removed from the people they were meant to guide. The Cathars filled that void with compassion. They tended to the sick, comforted the dying, and preached in the language of the people rather than in Latin. The villagers listened because they understood. And in that understanding, they began to change. The authority of Rome, once unshakable, began to fade into abstraction, a distant voice speaking rules to a people who had found truth in silence. Still, this was not an age of open rebellion. The Cathars did not seek to destroy the church, they simply sought to live differently. They held secret gatherings in fields under the moonlight, their songs rising softly into the night air. There were no cathedrals, no ornate rituals, only words, quiet and sincere. A man or woman who received the consolamentum, their sacred blessing, was said to be purified, freed from the prison of sin. To outsiders, this ceremony appeared almost mystical, but to the faithful, it was liberation. For the first time, they felt close to God without the weight of hierarchy pressing upon them. Travelers who passed through the region spoke of this strange purity with wonder and unease. Some said the people of Languedoc were too good, too trusting, that they mistook gentleness for holiness. Others, more fearful, whispered that such simplicity hid danger, that behind those peaceful eyes lurked the old serpent of heresy. Word spread northward, reaching abbots and bishops who had long been suspicious of the region's independence. To them, these good Christians were deceived by the devil, their kindness a veil for blasphemy. It was said that heresy spread like rot, unseen until it destroyed the heart of the tree. Yet for the people who lived there, the world still seemed full of promise. The markets of Toulouse and Carcassonne were alive with color. Fabrics dyed in deep blues and reds, spices from the east, the laughter of merchants and musicians. Troubadours sang verses about virtue and love, some inspired by the same ideals of purity the Cathars preached. It was a culture of lightness, where faith and art intertwined. But in that beauty lay the first signs of danger. Prosperity had made the region visible to those who valued power more than peace. And in the eyes of the church, this flourishing land, rich in spirit yet poor in obedience, had become suspect. When papal envoys arrived in Languedoc, they came not as conquerors but as judges cloaked in courtesy. They dined with local lords, listened to their songs, praised their cities, and took note of their faith. They saw women leading prayers, men refusing to take oaths, villagers who confessed not to priests but to one another. They saw reverence without control, devotion without fear. And they were afraid. Reports began to flow back to Rome, each more alarming than the last. The church, they warned, was losing its hold. The sheep had wandered too far from the shepherd, and wolves walked among them disguised as saints. Still, the church hesitated to act with force. Pope Innocent III, though resolute, hoped first to persuade. He sent missionaries, Cistercian monks trained in debate, eloquent men of learning, to preach the Orthodox faith and bring the lost back into the fold. Among them walked a young Spanish priest named Dominic, whose compassion and intellect would later make him a saint. He traveled barefoot, preached with humility, and argued not with anger but with patience. Yet even he saw that words alone could not reclaim Languedoc. The people respected him, but they loved their own teachers more. The Cathars' purity made every priest's luxury seem obscene, every bishop's comfort suspect. As the years passed, the air in the region grew heavier. The church's emissaries returned north, their patience worn thin. They spoke of defiance, of heretics who refused confession, who laughed at threats of excommunication. Rumors twisted truth into accusation, that the Cathars denied Christ, that they despised the sacraments, that they plotted against the church itself. None of it was entirely true, yet fear needs little truth to burn. The tension between faiths, between Rome's authority and Languedoc's conscience, had reached its breaking point. One could walk through the streets of Carcassonne or the fields of Montségur and feel it, that strange, invisible pressure, like the air before lightning strikes. The Cathars continued to meet in secret, the priests continued to warn against them, and ordinary people found themselves caught between two kinds of faith, one born of tradition, the other of conviction. Children were baptized in the church, but their parents whispered cathar prayers before sleep. Families began to live in quiet duality, torn between love for God and fear of Rome. And yet, even as the shadow lengthened, there was still peace, fragile, uncertain, but real. The people of Languedoc did not yet know that this peace would soon be shattered by fire. They did not know that their songs would fade beneath the sound of marching boots, or that their faith, once so pure, would become the reason for their destruction. For now, the vineyards still ripened under the sun, the bells still rang in distant abbeys, and the wind still carried the scent of lavender and prayer. But history remembers what they could not, that paradise often perishes not by sin, but by sanctity. The church believed it was defending truth. The Cathars believed they were living it. And between them, in the golden light of Languedoc, the shadows began to gather, patient, quiet, and certain of what was to come. It began with a death, sudden, brutal, and misunderstood. In the winter of 1208, a papal legate named Pierre de Castelnau rode through the cold mists of southern France, his mission simple in purpose but heavy with danger. He had been sent by Pope Innocent III to bring the lords of Languedoc back into obedience, to persuade or threaten them into rooting out the heresy that had spread through their lands. He was a man of faith, stern and loyal, but he was also a symbol, a living extension of the Church's authority. To defy him was to defy Rome itself. And yet, in a region where loyalty to the Church was already thin and tempers ran high, symbols could easily become targets. Pierre met with Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, a ruler torn between his people and the power that demanded their submission. Their meeting was tense, filled with accusations and cold civility. The legate condemned Raymond for tolerating heresy. Raymond protested that his people were faithful, that he ruled not devils but men. Neither was satisfied. When the legate departed, his mission incomplete, he could not have known that his death would ignite one of the darkest chapters in Christian history. The morning of his murder was quiet. Pierre and his companions rode along the banks of the Rhône, the mist rising from the water in pale ribbons. No armies marched, no banners flew, only the faint sound of hooves against frozen earth. Then came the strike. Some accounts say it was a lone knight, perhaps one of Raymond's men, acting in anger or impulse. Others claim it was a hired assassin. No one truly knows. What history does record is that Pierre de Castelnau fell beside the river, pierced by a blade, his blood staining the frozen ground. His body was carried away, but the wound it opened in the Church's pride would never heal. When news reached Rome, Pope Innocent III's grief turned swiftly to fury. To him, this was no mere crime. It was blasphemy made flesh, a direct assault on the sanctity of the Church. The murder of a papal legate, a servant of the Holy See, demanded not justice but vengeance. The Pope declared that heresy had now proven itself a poison, not just of souls but of society itself. If one legate could be slain, then no faith was safe, no law secure. The language of mercy vanished overnight. What replaced it was the rhetoric of war. Innocent's letters went forth across Christendom like thunderclaps. He summoned knights, nobles, and kings to take up arms, not against pagans or Muslims in distant lands, but against fellow Christians, the people of Languedoc. He promised the same indulgences granted to crusaders who fought in Jerusalem, forgiveness of sins, glory, and eternal reward. To the weary soldiers of the north, burdened by debt and restlessness, this was irresistible. They would march south not only to cleanse heresy, but to claim land, honor, and absolution. Raymond VI, terrified and desperate, swore innocence. He sent envoys to Rome, begging forgiveness, offering to join the Church's cause. But the tide had already turned. The Pope declared that divine justice must fall upon all who harbored heretics, and Raymond's name was whispered among the damned. His enemies, both political and spiritual, saw opportunity in his downfall. Armies began to gather under the banner of the cross, their armor polished, their hearts burning with zeal and ambition. The people of Languedoc did not yet understand what was coming. They heard rumors that armies of the north were marching, that the Pope himself had called for their destruction, but they could not imagine that the Holy Church would turn its wrath against its own flock. Many believed it was only bluster, that peace would return once tempers cooled. The Cathars continued their quiet worship, their prayers whispered in mountain villages and hidden homes. Mothers still baked bread, merchants still traded at market, children still played in the courtyards beneath the watchtowers. But in the distance, the horizon had begun to darken. As winter turned to spring, the roads filled with soldiers. They came from Flanders, Normandy, and Burgundy, rough men hardened by cold climates and constant war. They carried with them the blessings of priests and the scent of iron. Behind them came bishops, scribes, and banners emblazoned with the cross of Christ. But this cross did not promise redemption. It promised purification through blood. In the villages of the north, priests preached fiery sermons about heretics who mocked God, who spread corruption like disease. Congregations shuddered in fear and anger, convinced they were marching to defend not the Pope's pride, but the soul of Christendom itself. Raymond, cornered and powerless, agreed to humiliation. He stood barefoot before the papal legate Arnaud Amaury and begged forgiveness. He was scourged in public, his skin bleeding as a sign of repentance. But mercy was an illusion. The Pope's decree had already unleashed forces beyond control. By June of 1209, an army of tens of thousands assembled under the command of northern lords, their banners fluttering against the southern sky. Their cry was simple, Deus vult, God wills it. Yet no one could say whether it was God's will or man's hunger for power that truly guided their hands. In the villages of Languedoc, fear began to settle like dust. Word spread that the Crusaders had crossed into the south, that Béziers would be their first target. Refugees fled along the winding roads, clutching their few belongings, carrying children on their backs. They spoke of knights with eyes like stone, of priests blessing swords before they dripped with blood. Some sought sanctuary in the churches, believing no army would dare violate holy ground. Others buried their sacred texts, their small tokens of belief, hoping to preserve something of their faith before it was lost. For the Cathars, the meaning of faith began to shift. Once, it had been a quiet pursuit of purity. Now, it became a shield against terror. They prayed not for salvation but for endurance. They did not curse their persecutors. They simply waited, certain that suffering was the path to truth. Yet even they must have felt the tremor of fear when the smoke of the crusading army's fires rose beyond the hills. And so, from one man's death, perhaps an accident, perhaps vengeance, came a war that would burn for decades. A single drop of blood had been enough to baptize an entire generation in violence. The Church called it a crusade for faith. History remembers it as something else, the moment when faith began to devour its own children. The rivers of the south still flowed as they always had, the vineyards still glowed under the sun, but the spirit of the land had changed. The bells that once rang for prayer would soon toll for the dead. What began as the age of faith had found its spark of fear, and soon that spark would ignite the world. Béziers was not a fortress of war. It was a city of life, bustling markets, open courtyards, narrow streets shaded by stone balconies. Merchants called out from their stalls, the scent of bread and smoke filled the air, and the hum of voices echoed through its ancient walls. The people had heard of the approaching army, of course. Rumors had drifted south like ash, stories of banners bearing the cross, of knights sent by the Pope himself. Yet few believed the danger was real. This was a Christian city, loyal to the faith. Whatever heresy the Church accused them of, they thought surely God would not let his own be destroyed. They did not know that, to the men marching under the papal banner, the difference between believer and heretic no longer mattered. The first soldiers appeared on the horizon in July of 1209. From the towers of Béziers, sentries saw them, endless lines of men glinting in the sun, banners fluttering, priests walking among them with crosses raised high. The people gathered at the gates to watch, a mixture of awe and terror spreading through the crowd. By midday, the Crusaders had surrounded the city, their siege camps sprawling like a sea of iron. The sight was unlike anything the townsfolk had ever known. The air carried the smell of horses, sweat, and oil. Drums beat in the distance, steady as a heartbeat. The crusade had arrived. Inside the walls, chaos began to bloom. Some called for surrender, others demanded resistance. The priests urged calm, assuring the people that the church would not harm those who repented. But there was no clear command, no unity. Béziers was home not only to Catholics but also to many who followed the Cathar faith, and now suspicion poisoned every conversation. Neighbors who once shared bread now whispered accusations. Mothers wept for sons who took up arms with trembling hands. The air itself felt charged, thick with fear, thick with judgment. On the morning of July 22nd, the Crusaders attacked. It began not with a grand assault but with chaos. A group of townsmen, drunk on desperation, charged out of the gates in a reckless attempt to drive the invaders back. For a moment, they succeeded in surprising the enemy. The Crusaders stumbled, fell, regrouped. Then the Northern Knights retaliated with a fury that would echo through centuries. The defenders were cut down within minutes, and through that open gate the flood began. The army surged into the city like a tide of fire and steel. What followed was not a battle, it was an erasure. Swords met flesh, homes were torn apart, and the streets filled with screams. Men, women, children, all were struck down where they stood. The Crusaders had been promised forgiveness for their sins, and now they took it with zeal. Every strike of the blade, every torch raised to a thatched roof, was sanctified in their minds. The words of Christ, mercy, love, compassion, vanished beneath the roar of bloodlust. According to the chroniclers who followed the army, when a crusader asked how to distinguish heretics from faithful Catholics, the papal legate Arnaud Amaury gave a command that would haunt history: Cadite eos. Navit enim dominus cassantius. Kill them all, God will know his own. Whether those words were truly spoken or merely born of legend no longer matters. The slaughter that followed made them truth. The massacre lasted until dusk. Churches burned, their bells melting in the heat. Families who had sought sanctuary inside the cathedral were trapped as flames consumed the walls. The cries from within rose like a hymn of despair. Soldiers looted, priests blessed the dead, and the streets ran red with blood that carried down to the river. Béziers, once alive with song and trade, had become a silent wound. When night finally fell, the Crusaders stood among the ruins, their faces lit by the fires they had made. Smoke hung low over the city, thick enough to choke the breath. Some wept. Others prayed. A few sang hymns of victory, their voices trembling with exhaustion. To them, it was not murder but purification, the cleansing of a city diseased by heresy. Yet even in their triumph, there was unease. The scale of destruction was too great, the silence too deep. Somewhere within, conscience stirred, faint but undeniable. The survivors were few. Those who escaped fled south under the cover of darkness, carrying nothing but memory. They told of children cut down in the streets, of priests struck at the altar, of the cries that would not leave their ears. In their grief, they became witnesses to something larger, not just the fall of Béziers, but the beginning of a new kind of war. This was not conquest for land or gold, but annihilation in the name of purity. News of the massacre spread swiftly through the south. Villages whispered of the fate that had befallen Béziers, of how even those who prayed in churches had been killed. Panic rippled outward. Towns fortified their walls, hid their scriptures, and begged for divine mercy. For many, faith became fear. The cross, once a symbol of salvation, now marked the approach of death. The Crusaders, unshaken by the blood they had spilled, moved on. Béziers was left smoldering behind them, a warning to all who defied the will of Rome. They marched toward Carcassonne next, their banners bright against the southern sun, their hearts convinced that what they had done was holy. The Pope's vision of cleansing had taken form, and its name was fire. But beneath the ashes of Béziers, a darker truth lingered. The Church had declared war not on pagans, but on its own flock. The men who had died that day had been baptized, married, confessed, and buried in Christian soil. Their only crime was a difference in belief, a whisper of dissent. The world that rose from Béziers' ashes would never be the same. It was not just a city that had been destroyed, it was the illusion of unity itself. The fields around Béziers grew quiet in the following months. Where laughter and trade once filled the air, only crows remained. They picked at the bones of those left unburied, their calls echoing across the empty plains. The river that had carried wine and grain now carried memories of blood. Time would eventually erase the scent of fire, but it could not erase the silence of a city erased by faith. And in that silence, the crusade continued to march. The papal banners fluttered in the wind, priests blessing the path ahead. For them, Béziers was proof of divine favor. God had shown his will through their victory. For those who lived in the lands still untouched, it was a warning carved in flame, repentance or ruin. And for history, it became something else entirely, a question that would echo through every age that followed. When faith demands blood, what remains of the soul that believes? Carcassonne loomed in the distance like a mirage of stone and mist, its twin walls glimmering under the southern sun. From afar, it appeared unassailable, a fortress of faith and defiance, its towers watching the plains like sentinels of a forgotten age. To the crusaders marching toward it, the city was not merely another target, it was the heart of the Cathar resistance, a sanctuary of those who had survived Béziers and refused to yield. The banners of the cross fluttered as the army advanced, shimmering in the heat, the scent of summer fields soon replaced by the acrid tang of pitch and iron. Within the walls, the people waited, priests, merchants, families, all bracing for what they already knew would come. Raymond Roger Trencavel, the young Viscount of Carcassonne, ruled over the city. He was barely 24, yet already burdened by a legacy that demanded both courage and restraint. He had seen what happened to Béziers, he had heard the stories whispered by those who escaped, the screams, the fire, the words that justified slaughter. And now the same army stood at his gates. Unlike Béziers, Carcassonne was prepared. Its walls were high, its moats deep, its supplies stocked. But deep inside, fear festered. For what defense could stand against men who believed their violence was holy? When the Crusaders arrived in early August 1209, they encircled the city like a tightening noose. The siege engines were erected with practiced precision, trebuchets creaking as stones were hoisted into place. The sound of hammering filled the fields, mingling with the drone of distant prayers. From the walls, Carcassonne's defenders watched silently. They could see the campfires at night, an ocean of flickering orange stretching to the horizon. They could hear the chanting of priests blessing the siege. Every sunrise brought a new volley of stones crashing against the outer walls, sending tremors through the city's heart. Inside, the days blurred into one another. The citizens rationed food, drawing water from hidden wells. Children whispered questions their parents could not answer. The Cathar prefects, the spiritual leaders, urged calm, preaching that suffering purified the soul. Their serenity unsettled some and inspired others. At night, people gathered in the narrow streets, candles flickering as they prayed in silence. The walls that had once been symbols of safety now felt like the walls of a tomb. Raymond Roger tried diplomacy before bloodshed. He rode out beneath a white flag to meet the papal legate, Arnaud Amaury, and Simon de Montfort, the Crusade's most ruthless commander. The meeting was brief. Amaury, cold and composed, demanded unconditional surrender. Trencavel, proud and desperate, offered negotiation instead, safe passage for his people, amnesty for those accused of heresy. His words were met with silence. Simon de Montfort finally spoke, his voice calm and cutting. The Pope's will does not bargain. Trencavel returned to the city knowing what was to come. Yet he refused to flee. To abandon Carcassonne would mean abandoning every soul inside its walls. He resolved to endure, to trust in God's mercy even when God's name had become a weapon. But the siege tightened. Disease crept into the city, the summer heat turning water foul and wounds septic. The smell of death drifted through the streets, mingling with incense and smoke. Still, the defenders held the walls. Still they prayed. The Crusaders, too, began to suffer. The August sun was merciless, beating down on their armor until it burned the flesh beneath. Horses collapsed from exhaustion, men fainted from thirst. Yet they pressed on, fueled by faith and by the papal promise of forgiveness. At night, they sang hymns that floated eerily across the fields, their melodies mingling with the distant cries from the city. It was not just a war, it was a purification. Every strike of the battering ram, every psalm murmured before dawn, carried the weight of divine purpose. After 2 weeks, the city's wells began to dry. The defenders, parched and delirious, watched as the Crusaders' siege engines drew closer. Stones the size of oxen slammed into the walls, cracking the towers that had stood for centuries. The outer defenses fell first. A section near the river gave way with a sound like thunder. Panic spread. Some begged to fight to the death, others urged surrender before Bézier's fate was repeated. Trencavel gathered his remaining knights and made one last attempt to negotiate. He rode out again, unarmed, trusting in the sanctity of parley. But when he entered the enemy camp, he was seized. Simon de Montfort had him thrown into a dungeon, shackled in darkness. Leaderless and surrounded, Carcassonne fell soon after. The gates were opened not by force, but by despair. Yet this time, the Crusaders did not unleash another massacre. Perhaps even they had been shaken by Bézier's carnage. Instead, the citizens were expelled, men, women, and children driven from their homes under the burning sun, allowed to take nothing but the clothes they wore. Thousands stumbled into the wilderness, blinded by heat and grief. Behind them, Carcassonne was claimed in the name of the church. The Cathars were gone, the Viscount imprisoned, the city purified. Raymond Roger Trencavel would never see freedom again. He died in his cell a few months later, his body found slumped against the wall, the air rank with damp and decay. Some said he was poisoned, others that he simply gave up hope. The official record called it illness, but in truth, it was something else, the slow suffocation of a man crushed between loyalty and faith. His death became a whisper in the chronicles of the church, another name buried beneath the march of righteousness. When winter came, the Crusaders fortified their new prize. Carcassonne, once a beacon of southern culture and tolerance, now flew the papal banner. The walls still stood, but the spirit within had been broken. The language of the troubadours, the songs of love and freedom, fell silent. The people who once called it home scattered across the hills and valleys, carrying stories instead of swords. And as they wandered, they told their children of the day faith turned its gaze upon them, and did not blink. In the chronicles written later, the capture of Carcassonne was celebrated as a triumph of divine justice. The heretics had been cleansed, the land restored to purity. Yet the silence that followed was heavier than any victory song. For beneath the triumph lay something unspoken, a creeping dread that God's will had been reshaped by human hands. Those who survived the purge began to question, in whispers only, if the church could sanctify such suffering, then who could stand against its word? The crusade had conquered Carcassonne, but it had also conquered the hearts of those who feared. And fear, once planted, would grow for generations. The people of Languedoc learned that survival no longer depended on faith, but on silence. And so, silence became their prayer. Silence became their faith. Autumn crept across the Languedoc like a bruise that would not heal. The air grew colder, sharper, and the once golden fields turned the color of ash. The smoke of war still lingered in the sky, though months had passed since Carcassonne fell. Villages that had survived the Crusaders' first sweep now lived under a shroud of dread, waiting, listening, praying that the thunder of hooves would not return. Yet it always did. The crusade had become something far greater than anyone imagined. It was no longer a campaign of repentance, it was a machinery of faith turned to conquest. Every mile it advanced, the cross became heavier, its shadow stretching across the southern hills. In the town squares of newly conquered cities, the church began its next phase, the cleansing of belief. Those who once prayed in secret now faced a cruel choice: confess or vanish. The inquisitors were not yet the organized tribunal they would become in later centuries, but their seeds were already sown here. Priests were sent to root out heresy, monks to catalogue sin, and nobles to prove their loyalty through blood. The air of the Languedoc filled with murmurs of accusation, brother against brother, husband against wife. The simple act of keeping silent became dangerous, for silence could mean guilt, and guilt meant death. Among the displaced were those who had once followed the Cathar perfects, now scattered and hunted. They took refuge in caves, in ruined fortresses, in the forests that crept along the Pyrenees. There, by candlelight, they whispered their prayers, gentle, pacifist, stripped of ritual and gold. Their belief was simple, that God was light, and that the material world was darkness. But now, that light flickered under the breath of the Church's storm. The Crusaders hunted them not as soldiers, but as executioners. The papal legates declared that heresy was worse than murder, for it killed the soul. And so, mercy was no longer virtue, it was weakness. The campaign spread like wildfire. Castles that had stood for generations fell one by one: Minerve, Termes, Cabaret. Some resisted, others surrendered, but all were swallowed by the same fate. When the fortress of Minerve fell in 1210, its defenders were promised safety if they renounced their faith. More than 100 Cathars refused. They were led to a great pyre built outside the city walls, where they stood hand in hand, singing softly as the flames rose around them. The soldiers watched in silence, some crossing themselves, others looking away. The perfects did not scream. Their calm unnerved even their executioners. And when the fire consumed them, a strange stillness fell over the field, as though heaven itself had turned away. Simon de Montfort's name began to echo across France, praised in sermons and songs as the hand of God's justice. To his followers, he was a new kind of saint, one whose holiness was measured in victories and corpses. But to those who survived his passing, he was a figure of terror. Wherever he rode, repentance followed like a trail of smoke. His soldiers, hardened by years of holy war, no longer fought for faith but for power. They took lands, titles, and treasure, claiming each act of greed as divine right. The Church, seeing its will carried out with such zeal, turned a blind eye. It was easier to sanctify conquest than to question it. In the quiet corners of the countryside, the common people tried to continue their lives. They tilled the fields and prayed for rain, for safety, for the return of normal days. But even their prayers felt tainted now. They no longer knew what faith meant, whether to fear it, obey it, or run from it. At night, they would hear the distant bells of churches taken over by northern priests, their Latin chants strange and cold. The old songs of Occitania, songs of love, laughter, and the open sun, faded into memory. The land had fallen under the weight of a new order, one in which obedience replaced devotion and silence replaced grace. Yet, even in darkness, fragments of defiance remained. In the hills above Montségur, small bands of believers gathered again. They carried no swords, only the scriptures they had hidden from the flames. They taught their children to speak softly, to remember the names of those who had burned, to hold their faith like a secret flame. They knew they could not fight the Church with steel, but they could outlast it in memory. Every story they told, every whispered hymn, every hidden act of kindness, became a quiet rebellion. Meanwhile, Simon de Montfort pressed north, his ambition growing with each victory. He now sought to make himself lord of the entire south, reshaping the region in his image. But power breeds enemies, and even within the crusade, whispers of doubt began to spread. Some knights questioned the righteousness of their deeds. Others saw the Church's wealth grow and wondered whether salvation had been replaced by politics. The papal legates dismissed such murmurs as temptation, proof that Satan was testing the faithful. Yet the doubts lingered, unseen, unspoken. As the winter of 1211 fell, the landscape bore scars no season could heal. The burned ruins of towns glowed dimly under the frost. Roads were lined with abandoned carts and half-buried bones. And in the churches, beneath golden crucifixes, priests prayed for forgiveness in words they did not fully believe. The crusade had begun as a holy mission to save souls, but now it consumed them instead. In Rome, Pope Innocent III received word of the victories in the south with solemn satisfaction. He declared that the light of Christ was returning to France, that heresy was being cleansed from the soil. But even in his triumph, the tone of his letters grew more cautious. Reports of entire villages burned, of priests complicit in slaughter, reached his ears. Perhaps, For a moment, he wondered whether divine will had gone astray, whether zeal had swallowed faith whole. Yet he did not stop the crusade. He could not. For to halt it would be to admit that the Church, in its pursuit of purity, had birthed a monster it could no longer control. The Languedoc that emerged from those years was a land reshaped by fear. Its culture, once radiant with art, poetry, and tolerance, dimmed into silence. The people spoke less, prayed more, and learned to hide their thoughts behind bowed heads. The cross that had once promised salvation now loomed like a sword above them. The crusade had achieved its goal, heresy had been crushed. But what remained was not holiness. It was submission. And in that submission, the seeds of doubt took root, seeds that would one day grow into questions no fire could burn away. The years that followed were heavy with smoke and silence. The Languedoc, once the jewel of southern France, a land of song, tolerance, and sunlight, now seemed haunted by its own shadow. The Crusaders had claimed the cities, the castles, and the fields, but they could not claim the soul of the people. Beneath the watchful eyes of priests and inquisitors, faith no longer felt like light. It had become a thing of fear, a cage built from prayers, obedience, and whispered confessions. The Church called it peace, but the peace felt hollow, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Simon de Montfort ruled with iron certainty. He saw himself as God's chosen sword, the instrument through which divine justice would reshape the world. From his seat in Toulouse, he governed not with compassion, but with scripture sharpened into law. He ordered the destruction of every remnant of the old faith, books burned, altars dismantled, believers dragged from their homes. The lords of the South, once proud and free, now bowed to him in trembling silence. Those who resisted were stripped of their lands, their titles given to the northern knights who had followed him into war. To the Church, it was order restored. To the people, it was conquest sanctified. Everywhere, the signs of transformation were visible. The churches that once echoed with the gentle songs of the Cathar faithful now rang with the Latin chants of Rome. The frescoes on the walls were painted over, the old hymns forbidden. Even language became a battleground, the soft dialect of Occident replaced by the cold syllables of the North. In schools, children were taught to fear questioning, to see obedience as salvation. To doubt was to sin, and to sin was to vanish. The survivors of the old faith had become ghosts within their own homeland. Many hid in remote valleys or mountain fortresses, sustained by the few who dared to help them. They called themselves the Bones Homs, the good men, and they clung to a faith stripped bare of ritual, one that spoke of light and simplicity, of a God untainted by power. Each day they lived was an act of quiet defiance. Each prayer whispered beneath the moon was a reminder that belief could not be burned, only buried for a time. But Simon's hunger grew. What had begun as holy zeal turned into ambition. He desired not just the blessing of the Church, but the crown of the South itself. When the nobles of Toulouse and Foy rose against him, he saw not rebellion but heresy reborn. The wars flared again, smaller now, but crueler, more personal. Villages were pillaged, crops burned, fields salted. Those who had once been allies now turned against one another. Families split down the middle, one brother wearing the cross, the other hiding the heretics he was sworn to destroy. It was no longer clear who fought for God and who fought for pride. In the spring of 1213, Simon's forces clashed with the combined armies of southern lords at Muret. The battle was short but decisive. The Southerners fought for their homes, their language, their way of life. Simon fought for something colder, divine authority. When the dust settled, Raymond VI of Toulouse fled, his army scattered. The victory secured Simon's rule, but it also deepened the divide between the Church's vision and the people's suffering. The songs that were once sung in open courtyards now survived only in secret, lullabies whispered by mothers who feared their children would grow up believing only in obedience. And yet, cracks began to show. Simon's soldiers, worn by years of war, started to question their commander's cause. The promises of gold and salvation no longer filled their bellies or their hearts. The crusade, once ablaze with certainty, began to flicker. In the villages, people whispered that perhaps God had grown tired of blood. Even some priests began to speak softly of moderation, of mercy. But these voices were quickly silenced. The church could not afford doubt, not now that it had spilled so much blood to erase it. In 1218, as Simon laid siege to Toulouse for a second time, fate turned against him. During a skirmish near the city's walls, a stone from a mangonel struck him in the head, killing him instantly. The news spread through the south like a breath of wind through embers. To the church, it was a martyrdom, Simon de Montfort, slain in the service of God. To the people, it was something else entirely, the death of fear's first face. They buried him with ceremony, his sword placed upon his chest, his armor gleaming beneath the sun. But the light that shone upon him felt hollow, as if heaven itself refused to bless what it had once permitted. After his death, the crusade began to fracture. Leadership passed to lesser men, ambitious but uncertain, zealous but without vision. The momentum of faith gave way to politics. Nobles schemed, bishops argued, and the southern lands, though broken, began to breathe again. The church had won its war, but it had lost its purity. The same priests who had once preached against greed now quarreled over the spoils. The fires of judgment cooled into the embers of bureaucracy. What had been proclaimed as a holy crusade was slowly revealed for what it truly was, a conquest dressed in the robes of heaven. And yet, beneath the ashes, something fragile endured. In the mountains near Montségur, the last Cathars gathered, not to fight, but to remember. They built a refuge high among the clouds, where the air was thin and the silence deep. There, they prayed for a world that no longer existed, a world where faith did not demand blood. From their heights, they could see the valleys below, villages rebuilt, fields green again, churches rising where homes had burned. It seemed as though the land was healing. But they knew better. The scars were only hidden beneath the soil, waiting for history to remember them. The Crusade's banners faded, its armies disbanded, but its spirit lingered, not in triumph, but in warning. The church had proven its power, yet it had also exposed its fear. The fear of difference, of freedom, of the human soul unbound by control. And that fear, once born, could never be fully erased. As winter descended once more over the Languedoc, an uneasy stillness returned. The wars were over, the fires gone out, but the echo of them remained, in the prayers of the conquered, in the silence of ruined cathedrals, in the wind that whispered through empty fields. The church had won its crusade. But in doing so, it had lost something greater than heresy could ever take, the faith of those who once believed without fear. Years passed, but the wound left by the crusade never truly healed. The people of the South tried to rebuild their lives, piecing together fragments of a world that had been shattered by faith and fire. The fields were sown again, the villages reawakened with the smell of bread and wood smoke, but something essential had been lost, a sense of trust, of belonging, of divine justice. The church stood taller than ever, its cathedrals rising like mountains of stone across the landscape, yet within those walls the prayers sounded hollow, as though even heaven had grown weary of their echo. Among the ruins of the old castles, travelers whispered of strange lights at night, lanterns that burned where no one lived, voices that carried on the wind. They said the spirits of the Cathars still wandered there, unburied in both body and soul, searching for the light they had once believed was eternal. In Montségur, where the last stronghold of their faith had fallen in fire, the ground itself was said to tremble in winter, as if remembering. The peasants refused to till that soil. They said it belonged to the dead. The church dismissed these tales as superstition, yet even the priests crossed themselves when the wind rose at dusk. A new order emerged, one of quiet obedience and slow forgetting. The Inquisition took root in these same lands, its agents dressed in black robes, carrying books heavier than swords. They did not burn cities as the Crusaders had, but they burned something deeper, doubt. They taught that to question was to sin, that silence was salvation. They listened at doors, recorded confessions, and punished whispers. Under their gaze, truth became something dangerous, best hidden behind closed lips. The people learned to speak in fragments, to smile in public and pray in secret. An entire culture of secrecy grew out of survival. Still, not all memories could be erased. In lonely farmhouses and mountain huts, the stories of the good men were kept alive. Old women told their grandchildren of the gentle faith that had once guided their ancestors, a faith that asked for no gold, built no palaces, and demanded no blood. The children would listen wide-eyed, half afraid, half awed, and when they grew older, they would pretend to forget, but the story stayed, like embers glowing beneath the ash. Even centuries later, the songs sung at harvest or by the hearth carried strange refrains, fragments of cathedral hymns twisted into folk melodies. The church heard them too and frowned, but it could not silence music carried by memory. By the 14th century, the world had changed. Kings now ruled where barons once fought, and the church, though still powerful, had begun to fracture beneath the weight of its own certainty. The papacy moved to Avignon, ironically, deep in the heart of the land once condemned for heresy. The irony was not lost on the people. They said softly, "The seat of God has come to the soil it once damned." The priests avoided such talk, but they could not stop it. The stones of the old fortresses still stood, watching, silent witnesses to what faith had done. In Toulouse, merchants grew wealthy once more, poets returned to their craft, and scholars debated philosophy beneath candlelight. Yet behind their brilliance lay the ghost of what had been lost, the free thought, the luminous simplicity that the Cathars had once carried like a lantern through the dark. Some scholars began to rediscover old manuscripts, fragments that had survived the burnings, words about purity, light, and balance. They copied them in secret, hiding them within prayer books and ledgers. The Inquisition hunted these fragments, but they multiplied all the same, spreading quietly across Europe. The ideas could not be chained. And so, the legacy of the Crusade transformed. From fire into memory, from sword into story. It became a warning whispered through generations, that even in the name of salvation, cruelty remains cruelty. The Languedoc became a land of poets and dreamers, haunted by its past yet defined by its endurance. The people learned that survival itself could be a kind of rebellion. They no longer prayed for paradise beyond death but for peace within life. There were nights when travelers crossing the southern hills would swear they saw figures standing among the ruins, not ghosts of vengeance, but of sorrow. Men and women dressed in white, their faces calm, holding lanterns that never went out. They would watch silently until the mist swallowed them, leaving behind only the scent of smoke and wild thyme. Perhaps it was imagination. Or perhaps, as some believed, it was the land remembering what it could not forgive. Centuries later, historians would call it the first genocide of Europe, but for those who lived through it, it was something even darker, the loss of innocence. The Church had sought to erase heresy, but in doing so, it had erased the purity of its own purpose. The Crusaders had claimed to fight for light, yet they left behind only shadows. And from those shadows grew a question that no priest could ever answer. If God is love, then who speaks for the slain? In the quiet of the Languedoc hills, where the wind hums through broken stone and the stars gleam cold above Montségur, the question still lingers. The grass has grown thick over the graves, and time has softened the scars, but when the night is still, you can almost hear it, the faint echo of a hymn that once defied an empire. It drifts like mist, gentle and unending, carrying with it the last words of the Cathar faithful as they faced the flames. We shall return not as bodies, but as light. By the late 13th century, Europe had begun to shift. The crusading zeal that once consumed the hearts of kings and peasants alike was dimming, replaced by a colder, more calculated form of power, one cloaked in parchment, coin, and silence. The Church, having purged its enemies, turned its gaze inward. It had grown vast and immovable, its cathedrals towering over cities like mountains of stone, its priests robed in silk, its treasuries gleaming with offerings once meant for God. But beneath this grandeur lay unease, a restlessness born of guilt and decay. For though the heretics were gone, their questions remained. The voices silenced by fire had not vanished. They had sunk deep into the soil, whispering through time. In Avignon, the papal court glittered with wealth. Cardinals dined on silver, and their laughter echoed through marbled halls. Pilgrims who came seeking holiness found bureaucracy instead. The faith that had once promised redemption now demanded obedience, and those who resisted did so quietly, in the dark corners of monasteries or in the pages of forbidden texts. Among scholars, a subtle rebellion began to stir, not of swords but of thought. They studied the ancients, spoke of reason, and dared to suggest that perhaps truth was not confined to the church alone. The memory of the Cathars, though forbidden, took on new forms. In secret gatherings, some spoke of the duality of light and shadow, of a God who was not the destroyer of flesh but the liberator of spirit. They no longer called themselves Cathars, that name had been burned away, but their ideals lingered, reborn in poetry and philosophy. Troubadours sang of lost purity, of love untainted by power, of light unbound by dogma. Their songs were gentle rebellions, carrying echoes of a vanished faith disguised as romance and allegory. The Inquisition heard these melodies and frowned but could not silence them. Music, like memory, was impossible to contain. Meanwhile, ordinary people felt the slow shift of faith from the heart to the institution. The simplicity of belief that once comforted the poor was now wrapped in Latin and law. A farmer kneeling at a wooden cross might wonder whether his prayer reached heaven or vanished beneath the weight of gold and ritual. The church still promised salvation, but it felt distant, a gatekeeper to grace rather than its messenger. Even the priests began to whisper doubts during confession, murmuring that the voice of God had grown quiet. In the villages of southern France, where the ashes of the crusade had once fallen, a strange reverence persisted. The people spoke less of saints and more of souls, the kind of quiet faith that asked for no recognition. On moonless nights, candles still flickered on forgotten hills, left by those who remembered not the names, but the feeling of the lost faith, peace without fear, love without judgment. Children who asked what the lights were would be told, "The good ones are praying again," and nothing more. The church, ever wary, sent priests to remind the people of orthodoxy, but even they sometimes paused on those hills and felt a presence too ancient to condemn. Across Europe, questions began to take shape in the minds of thinkers and mystics alike. Could faith survive without cruelty? Could truth endure without punishment? Men like Meister Eckhart and the Beguines of the Low Countries began to speak of inner divinity, of a God not found in cathedrals but within the human soul. Their words were dangerous, and yet they spread like wildfire beneath the watchful eyes of the clergy. In many ways, they were the heirs of the Cathars, unaware of their lineage but carrying the same spark. The more the church sought to suppress the inner light, the more it burned within the hearts of those who dared to seek. The shadow of the Inquisition, however, did not fade. In the archives of Toulouse and Carcassonne, inquisitors documented every whisper of dissent. Their parchment scrolls became tombs of truth, each confession a small death. They claimed to defend the faith, yet their own hearts were darkened by fear, fear of failure, fear of doubt, fear that perhaps the heretics had not been wrong after all. Some inquisitors grew haunted by their work, waking at night to the smell of smoke that was no longer there, hearing the cries of those they condemned echo through their dreams. Even righteousness can rot when it forgets mercy. As the century turned and the old world began to crumble beneath plagues and wars, people found themselves questioning everything: kings, priests, even heaven itself. The Black Death would soon come, and with it the undoing of the illusion that divine favor protected the faithful. In the face of death, the church's power faltered, and once again, people turned inward for meaning. The seeds planted by the Cathars, the belief that divinity could exist in simplicity, that truth could live beyond walls, began to stir once more. What had been burned was now reborn, not as rebellion, but as reflection. And so the cycle continued: belief and fear, power and loss, faith and silence. The church's darkest secret was not merely the cruelty it had unleashed, but the quiet knowledge that it had killed something it could never replace: the purity of intention. The Cathars had sought to free the soul from the world's corruption, but it was the world, not the soul, that triumphed. Yet even in defeat, their echo endured, a soft, persistent hum beneath the roar of history. If one were to stand among the ruins of Montségur today, beneath the vast sky of Languedoc, they might feel it, the strange stillness, the air heavy with memory. The grass sways where pyres once burned, the stones are warm with sunlight, and the wind moves like a whisper across the centuries. The faith that turned to fear, that was broken by fire and silence, still lingers there, not as doctrine, not as heresy, but as a question that has outlived both the church and its enemies. When power claims to serve God, who serves the truth? The dawn of the 14th century brought with it both light and shadow. Europe was changing in ways the old crusaders could never have imagined. Trade routes stretched farther than ever before, carrying silk, spices, and ideas across continents. New cities rose, brimming with merchants, artists, and thinkers, and yet beneath all the progress, the ghosts of the past refused to rest. In the south of France, where faith had once turned to fear, people still spoke in whispers about the fires of Montségur and the lost purity of the good men. The world around them was moving forward, but their hills and valleys still carried the memory of judgment. The church, now more powerful than any monarch, had become both shepherd and sovereign. The papacy's move to Avignon had turned spiritual authority into something worldly, a blend of devotion and diplomacy. Cardinals lived in luxury, surrounded by painted ceilings and gold-leaf manuscripts. Their hands, once raised in benediction, now signed decrees of excommunication and taxation. Yet, within those same palaces, cracks were beginning to form. Some priests whispered of reform, others feared that the church's soul was growing distant from its purpose. The Inquisition, though quieter than before, still lingered, a shadow in every city, a reminder of what awaited those who questioned too deeply. In these years, Europe began to tremble beneath the weight of its contradictions. Philosophers sought truth through reason, mystics through silence, and peasants through faith that asked for little more than hope. Everywhere, there was a hunger, not for power or conquest, but for meaning. Many found themselves drawn to the same questions that the Cathars had once asked. What is evil, and who defines it? Can a loving God dwell in a world filled with pain? And if the soul is light, why must it burn to be free? The church did not welcome such questions, but it could not silence them as it once had. Too many had seen the cost of suppression. Too many had watched the faithful turn into executioners. In the universities of Paris and Bologna, scholars debated the nature of divine justice. Some dared to suggest that salvation might not belong solely to the baptized. Their words were cautious, cloaked in allegory and academic rhetoric, but their meaning was unmistakable. The memory of the Cathars lived in their defiance, not through bloodlines or confession, but through the courage to question. As time passed, the story of the crusade began to fade from official records. Chroniclers softened its brutality, turning massacres into acts of faith, inquisitors into guardians of purity. The church preferred it that way. History, after all, was another kind of sermon, one that could cleanse the sins of power with careful language. But the people did not forget. In taverns, in fields, in quiet family gatherings, the truth lived on in stories passed from mouth to mouth. A grandmother might tell her granddaughter about the hill that glowed red one winter night, and though she called it legend, her eyes would betray the truth. By the mid-14th century, Europe was struck by the greatest calamity it had ever known, the Black Death. Cities emptied, churches filled with the dead, and prayers went unanswered. The plague did what no heresy or war could. It humbled the church. The same priests who had once condemned others now begged for mercy. Faith itself seemed fragile, cracking under the weight of loss. For many, it was a moment of awakening. If death spared neither pope nor peasant, then perhaps salvation was not the domain of priests, but of the soul alone. The fear that had bound people to the church began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet, personal spirituality, one that bore the faint imprint of those who had once dared to believe differently. It was during this time that the first secret books began to circulate, copies of ancient writings thought long destroyed. Fragments of the Gospel of John, lines from Gnostic hymns, verses that spoke of inner light and divine truth. They spread like whispers in the dark, passed hand to hand among those who longed for something purer than penance. Each word was a small rebellion, each page a candle against centuries of control. No one called it heresy anymore, but the spirit behind it was unmistakable. It was the return of a forgotten fire, burning not in cathedrals, but in hearts. The church, wounded but still standing, tried to regain its hold through spectacle. Grand processions filled the streets, relics were paraded before the sick, and sermons promised that the plague was divine punishment for hidden sins. Yet even these gestures rang hollow. The people had learned too much suffering to fear it any longer. They looked at the relics with tired eyes, wondering why holiness always seemed to demand gold. In the silence of their homes, they prayed differently, not to saints or statues, but to something unseen, something within. Generations later, the fires of Montségur would be little more than a story, but their lesson would endure. From those ashes, a new kind of faith would rise, quieter, humbler, rooted not in power but in compassion. When the Renaissance dawned, it would carry within it the same light the Church had tried to extinguish, the belief that truth could live beyond dogma, that beauty was sacred, and that knowledge was divine. Every brushstroke of a painter, every verse of a poet, every whispered prayer of a peasant bore the invisible legacy of those who once died for the right to believe differently. And so, as Europe stepped into its new age, it did so unknowingly guided by the ghosts of its past. The Church, though still mighty, could never again command unquestioning faith. The seeds of doubt, planted in blood and fire, had grown into wisdom. The story of the 13th century's heresy was no longer just a tragedy, it had become a parable. It spoke of what happens when belief becomes fear, and when love turns to domination. But it also whispered something more enduring, that even in the darkest times, truth waits, patient, eternal, and unburnable. If one listens closely, perhaps on a quiet night in Languedoc, the past still breathes. The wind through the ruins carries the faint echo of prayers once forbidden, and the stars above seem to shimmer with an understanding older than any creed. It is there, in that stillness, that the story truly ends, not with fire or forgiveness, but with remembrance. The Church's darkest secret was not only its cruelty, but the light it could never destroy. And though centuries have passed, that light remains, flickering softly in every soul that dares to seek without fear. Night falls over the ruins of Montségur, and the stones seem to breathe. The last glow of the sun fades behind the Pyrenees, and the air turns cold, carrying with it the scent of time, dust, and memory. To stand there is to feel the centuries fold in on themselves, the whispers of the past threading through the grass, the silence heavy with all that cannot be said. The fortress above is only a skeleton now, a broken crown of walls and towers, but its presence is immense. The wind does not simply move through it, it lingers as though the mountain itself remembers. Travelers who visit here rarely speak loudly. There is a strange reverence in the air, a stillness that commands humility. The legend says that the souls of the last Cathars never left this place. On the night of their martyrdom, as the fires roared and the valley filled with light, they sang. Not in fear, not in defiance, but in peace. Their voices rose like smoke into the heavens, carrying a single belief, that light cannot be destroyed, only hidden. The Church thought it had silenced them, but their song never ended. It changed form, into the murmur of streams, the rustle of leaves, the hush that falls before dawn. Even now, when the moon hangs low and the wind is still, some claim they can hear it, a faint melody, wordless yet filled with meaning, echoing through the stones. Centuries have passed, and the faith that once turned to fear has become something softer, something almost sacred in its silence. Scholars, tourists, and wanderers alike come here searching for answers, but what they find is something different, a feeling, an awareness that history is not truly gone. It lingers, waiting for those willing to listen. Some come with cameras, others with prayers, but by the time they leave, all carry the same quiet understanding that what was destroyed by fire was never lost, only transformed. The land around Montségur seems ordinary at first glance. Rolling green hills, small villages nestled in the valleys, sheep grazing in the distance. Yet there is a pulse beneath it, a heartbeat of something ancient. The locals still tell stories, though never in full. An old woman in a nearby village might tell you that when storms roll down from the mountains, you must light a candle and place it on the windowsill, not to ward off evil, but to guide the lost souls home. Some say that the fire still burns beneath the earth, not as flame but as warmth, the lingering trace of those who died believing that love could exist without cruelty. When the first historians returned to these lands centuries later, they came seeking documents, evidence, the measurable remains of the past. What they found instead was something intangible, a faith that had outlived its name. The Cathars no longer existed in any formal sense, yet their ideals had found a strange immortality. The world had changed, kingdoms had fallen, languages had evolved, even the church itself had been reshaped by reformation and reason. But the idea that truth might belong to the soul rather than the institution had survived. It had seeped quietly into modern thought, into the very idea of conscience. Every whisper of rebellion against blind obedience, every defense of spiritual freedom, bore the faint shadow of Montségur. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of the 13th century, not the Crusades, not the edicts, not the fires, but the endurance of light in a world determined to extinguish it. The Church's greatest failure was its belief that control could purify. In trying to define holiness, it desecrated it. In trying to silence heresy, it taught the world to listen more carefully. The Cathars' truth was not in their doctrine, but in their refusal to hate. They were flawed, human, perhaps naive, but in their final hour, they chose peace over vengeance, love over terror. That choice echoes more powerfully than any creed. Today, the fortress stands as both monument and mirror. Tourists climb its steep path, pausing often to catch their breath, unaware that they are retracing the final steps of those who walked to the pyre. The air grows thinner near the summit, the world smaller below. From the top, the view stretches endlessly, valleys bathed in gold, distant hills fading into blue mist. It is beautiful, almost unbearably so. Standing there, it is easy to believe that this place was chosen not for defense, but for transcendence. That the Cathars built their refuge close to heaven because they believed heaven was already here. As dusk deepens, the world turns silent. The shadows grow long, and the first stars appear, glimmering above the ruined towers. The silence is not emptiness, it is presence. The kind that fills you with both awe and sorrow. It is said that if you whisper a question into the wind at Montségur, it will answer, not with words, but with feeling. Those who have tried claim the same response. A deep, steady calm, as though the mountain itself is saying, "It is finished, but not forgotten." In that calm lies the story's true end. History remembers dates and doctrines, but the soul remembers the human truth, the fear, the faith, the hope. The Cathars were destroyed, but what they believed in was not. It found new shapes across centuries. In mystics who spoke of divine love, in thinkers who sought inner light, in every person who has ever questioned cruelty done in the name of righteousness. Their fire became wisdom, their suffering became compassion. And so, Montségur remains not a grave, but a threshold, between what was and what still is. Between faith and freedom. Between silence and understanding. The Church's darkest secret was never the violence itself, but the realization that even in victory, it had lost something it could never reclaim, the purity of its own beginnings. Yet out of that loss came something the Church could not foresee, a quiet, unbreakable inheritance of empathy. When the wind rises over Montségur, it carries both lament and grace. It does not speak of guilt or vengeance, but of remembrance, of what happens when light and shadow meet, and both are finally seen. And in that moment, standing alone among the ruins, you might understand why they sang as they burned. Not because they believed they would be saved, but because they already were. Dawn comes slowly to the mountains of Languedoc. The mist lifts from the valleys in long, ghostly ribbons, and the first light spills over the stones of Montségur like a benediction. The air is cold, clean, and still, the kind of stillness that feels earned, as if bought with centuries of silence. Down below, the small villages begin to wake. Smoke curls from chimneys, bells ring softly from ancient towers, and life moves on, unaware of how much of its peace was born from the ashes of struggle. Yet for those who climb the path to these ruins, there is no mistaking it. This is not merely a place, but a story made of earth and air. The ground itself feels watchful, as though it carries the memory of every footstep that ever walked toward fire and faith. The world beyond has long since changed. The church that once wielded power like a weapon has been transformed, its edges softened by time, its dogmas reshaped by doubt and reform. Empires have risen and fallen, and mankind has reached heights once unimaginable, crossing oceans, mapping stars, and questioning everything that was once taken as absolute truth. Yet the shadow of the 13th century remains, subtle but persistent, woven into the very fabric of Western conscience. Every time humanity asks whether power can coexist with purity, or whether belief can survive without fear, the echo of that age answers softly, reminding us where the line was first crossed. History records the Albigensian Crusade as a campaign of faith, but in truth, it was a lesson, a mirror held to humanity's darkest impulse, to destroy what it does not understand. It showed that even the holiest intentions, when bound to authority, can become instruments of cruelty. The Church had set out to save souls but had forgotten what a soul truly was. It sought to extinguish heresy, but it ended up dimming the light of its own compassion. And yet, in that act of destruction, something remarkable happened. The heresy survived, not in form but in essence. The belief that truth belongs to every heart, that no power can dictate its shape, endured like an ember in the wind. Through centuries, that ember drifted. It flickered in the quiet defiance of mystics who spoke of divine love beyond the Church's reach. It burned in the words of reformers who challenged the corruption of faith. It glowed in poets who found God in nature rather than in doctrine, and in philosophers who sought the divine through reason and empathy. Every act of courage that rose against oppression, every voice that said no to fear disguised as holiness, carried within it the unspoken inheritance of the Cathars. Their light had scattered, but it had never gone out. And perhaps that is the truest measure of immortality, not to be remembered in name, but to live on in the choices of others. The people of Languedoc never built monuments to the fallen, because they did not need to. The mountains were monument enough. The wind that moves through the valleys, the wildflowers that bloom each spring, the long shadows cast by the fortress at dusk, all of it bears quiet witness. Every season renews what was once destroyed. Life itself becomes remembrance. Visitors who come to Montségur today often describe the same feeling. They arrive curious, leave silent. Standing among the ruins, surrounded by endless sky, they speak of a calm that feels almost sacred, as though the world itself pauses there. The stones seem to hum faintly in the sunlight, a low, wordless song. No plaques tell the story, no priests offer explanations, and yet everyone who stands there understands. They may not know the history in detail, the Crusade, the Inquisition, the thousands who perished, but they feel it, the human truth of it. The weight of conviction, the cost of belief, the strange beauty of endurance. It is said that the truest faith is born not from fear of punishment, but from love of truth. That lesson, carved from centuries of silence, is the gift Montségur gives to all who listen. The Church's darkest secret, the one buried beneath its chronicles and erased from its sermons, was that it once mistook control for salvation. But history, like the soul, cannot be confined. In the long arc of time, truth reclaims itself. Every generation that chooses understanding over judgment, empathy over dominance, keeps that reclamation alive. As the day brightens, light floods through the gaps in the ruined walls, scattering across the stones like fragments of stained glass. The fortress no longer guards against armies, it guards something far more fragile, memory. Not the memory of names or dates, but of meaning. The meaning of what happens when faith forgets love. The meaning of courage that endures even in defeat. The meaning of silence that speaks louder than any sermon. Below, the valley hums with life again. Children's laughter, church bells, the sound of wind sweeping through the grass. The people who live here no longer speak of heresy or crusade, yet unknowingly they live in the balance born of both. Their faith, whatever shape it takes, is gentler now. Their prayers are quiet, their kindness is unspoken. The world they inhabit is not perfect, but it is wiser, because it remembers, even without words, the cost of forgetting. And when night returns to Montségur, as it always does, the stars rise one by one over the dark ridges of the Pyrenees. The ruins glow faintly under their light, timeless and patient. Somewhere, Far below, a candle flickers in a farmhouse window, a small, trembling flame, like the last heartbeat of a dream. It is enough. The wind passes softly through the stones, carrying the oldest truth of all, that faith without love is only fear, and fear, left unchallenged, will always burn. But love endures. It endures through silence, through ruin, through centuries. It endures in every hand that chooses to build rather than destroy, in every voice that dares to speak kindness where cruelty once reigned. The Cathars' fire became their end, but also their message, that light, once born, cannot be unmade. The Church's darkest secret may have been its fallibility, but humanity's brightest truth was born from it, that no authority can claim ownership of the divine. As the wind fades and the night deepens, Montségur sleeps again, not in sorrow, but in peace. The mountain keeps its vigil, the stars keep their silence, and somewhere within that silence, the song continues. Soft, endless, unbroken. The same song that rose from the flames long ago, the hymn of those who believed that truth, once found, must never bow to fear. Centuries after the fires died and the fortress walls crumbled, Europe began to awaken into an age of reason. The iron grip of blind faith loosened, and the whispers of inquiry and doubt, once punishable by death, became the language of progress. Philosophers began to ask the same forbidden questions that the Cathars had died for. What is truth? What is the nature of good and evil? Can the divine exist without fear, without control? The same questions that once ignited the wrath of the Inquisition now guided the birth of modern thought. The Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment, all of them, in some quiet way, carried the echoes of those silenced voices. In the candlelit rooms of scholars and reformers, the story of Languedoc resurfaced. It was not always named, not always spoken aloud, but it was there, a haunting presence in the conscience of Europe. The idea that faith could be pure, free from corruption, that belief could live without violence, began to re-emerge. It was as if the world was slowly remembering something it had once known but had been forced to forget. Artists painted angels with human sorrow in their eyes. Poets wrote of redemption found not in cathedrals but in the human heart. And philosophers, from Erasmus to Voltaire, began to turn their gaze inward, seeking a morality that did not depend on the fear of hell or the promise of heaven. Yet the Church, too, was changing. Its once mighty certainty was shaken by centuries of contradiction, by wars waged in God's name and scandals that could no longer be buried. The world it sought to rule had grown vast and restless, its people learning to read, to think, to question. Reformers rose within its ranks, calling not for destruction, but renewal. They spoke of Christ's compassion, not conquest, of mercy, not might. For every tyrant priest that history remembers, there were also those who quietly tended to the poor, who forgave when it was easier to condemn. The Church began, slowly and painfully, to see its own reflection, to recognize that salvation demanded humility, not supremacy. In the centuries that followed, the story of the Cathars became legend, a ghost of history, half remembered, half erased. Scholars debated their beliefs, artists romanticized their fall, and travelers came to Montségur not to mourn, but to feel. The mountain became a symbol, not of defeat, but of endurance. Its silence spoke louder than any sermon. The stones, weathered and scarred, bore witness to an ancient truth that could not be unlearned, that faith, when divorced from love, becomes its own kind of darkness. And that darkness, no matter how long it reigns, can never extinguish the dawn. But the world did not fully escape the cycle. The lessons of the 13th century would echo again, in different guises, in which trials and inquisitions reborn, in empires cloaked in piety, in ideologies that promise salvation through obedience. Humanity, it seemed, could not resist the temptation to control what it feared. The faces changed, the creeds evolved, but the hunger for certainty remained. Yet with each repetition came resistance, quiet at first, then growing. Every age has its heretics, its dreamers, its voices that refuse to be silenced. And in each of them, the old fire burns, a remnant of that forgotten mountain faith. In the modern world, the Church's shadow still lingers, but it no longer falls as it once did. Cathedrals stand as monuments to beauty rather than power, their bells calling to reflection rather than obedience. Theology now shares its seat with science and reason with wonder. Faith has grown softer, more human, no longer a fortress, but a conversation. Pilgrims who once traveled to Rome for absolution now journey inward, seeking forgiveness from themselves. The world has grown vast, complex, uncertain, but perhaps in that uncertainty lies its greatest hope. And yet, even now, the story of the Cathars feels unfinished. It lingers not as a tragedy, but as a question. What would the world look like if faith had chosen love instead of fear? If the Church had embraced the seekers rather than silenced them? Perhaps we would have learned earlier what took centuries to understand, that the divine does not demand conquest, but compassion, not obedience, but understanding. Perhaps we would have spared ourselves countless wars, countless burnings, countless wounds inflicted in the name of truth. But perhaps, too, it was necessary that humanity, to grow, must face its own shadow, must learn the hard way what it means to believe. The ruins of Montségur stand now as more than a relic. They are a threshold between the world that was and the world that could have been. To walk among them is to feel both loss and possibility. The wind that sweeps through the broken arches feels almost like a voice, whispering of what endures when the body fails, when the temple falls, when every institution built on fear crumbles. What remains is the quiet, stubborn pulse of truth. It does not belong to any church, any book, any creed. It belongs to the human spirit itself, fragile, defiant, eternal. And as twilight settles once more over the mountain, the sky deepens to a shade of violet unseen anywhere else on earth. The air cools, the last birds fall silent, and for a brief moment, the ruins seem to glow from within. Not with fire, but with memory. The kind of memory that does not fade, because it lives not in the mind, but in the marrow of the world. The kind of memory that hums softly in every act of kindness, in every question asked in the dark, in every refusal to hate. For faith, when stripped of fear, becomes something vast and luminous. It becomes the quiet strength to face the unknown, the grace to forgive what cannot be undone, and the courage to keep believing, not in dogma, but in goodness. That is the inheritance of those who burned, the legacy of those who refused to bow. It is the truest miracle of all, that from the ashes of control, freedom was born. And from the ruins of the Church's darkest secret, a new kind of light began to rise, one that needs no permission to shine. The stars hang motionless above Montségur, as if time itself has chosen to rest. The mountain sleeps, but its story breathes in the wind, a whisper carried across ages. Down in the valley, the world hums with new life, unaware of the sacred silence above. Faith has changed, the world has changed, yet the lesson endures. Love must always guide belief. As the night deepens, the ruins fade into shadow, and the old fire becomes starlight, quiet, eternal, and free. In that stillness, truth remains untouched, not in temples, but in the human heart.